this is kind of a roll your sleeves up kind of sermon. You kind of got to sit and roll your sleeves up and get ready for what Jesus is talking about in here. And to start off, this is Good Shepherd Sunday. Is the church, especially the Lutheran Church, has laid out its readings and laid out its emphasis. We're right now in what's called the season of Easter, or after Easter, and looking forward to Pentecost. This is a traditional Sunday where we talk about Jesus as the Good Shepherd. One of the things that in our other services in here this morning is the Psalm 23. And this, as we said, the reading just a minute ago was about God's love for us and our love for each other. But it's based upon what God has loved us, especially the shepherd, Jesus Christ, that incredible love that he has for us, that he pours out his love. We saw it in baptism. We see it on a cross where God takes tangible action to let us know that he loves us and forgives us. But he sits there and he says, going in, is that not only has God loved you, but now go and love one another. You see that in our emphasis. You see it around where we're at. Love God, love others, and make disciples. But it's this love others is going in here. And Pastor John last week talked about how we as a congregation and we as the church loved others when they were in Zambia. And we heard about the endeavors of that and how they went in and loved the people over at the East Africa Missionaries. If you want to see the sermon, you can catch it on the webpage. If you want to see the video that was shown, contact us in the office. We can get you that. But it's how we love others. And at times if we sit and we're honest, right, there's people who are actually easy to love, right? I call them decent folk. They're decent in the world, right? They go in here, they've got their lawns mowed, they've got their houses cleaned up, there's no cars laying in the front lawn, they pay their taxes, they obey the laws. They're just good, honest folk, right? And you meet them, and you're instantly drawn to them, and you meet them, and you start talking with them, and it's this instantaneously here is that there's this connection, and they just make it easy to love them. You with me? Right? Everybody knows some of those people, right? There's other people that are a little more difficult. They're a little more difficult in life. You know, they're not difficult, hard people, but they're not those easy ones. We kind of have a nickname for them around here. You call them EGRs. It's called extra grace required. Right? It takes a little more effort. It takes a little more concentration. It's a little more willpower. It doesn't quite come as naturally as the decent folks, but it comes and it's there, right? Then there are people like Frank. Former congregation I was in and served with, there was a guy by the name of Frank, and Frank and I had our disagreements. And we'd always sat down and talked about it. We'd sit and we'd have a problem, a disagreement. We'd sit down, and sometimes he'd come in here and we'd talk about a problem, and sometimes it was this. We'd find a middle ground in here and say, okay, here's the middle ground, understand. Sometimes in here we'd come in, and I would realize that I'd made a mistake. And I'd go, okay, you're right, Frank, I'm sorry. And sometimes Frank would sit there and go, well, Pastor, I guess. It's about as close you could get at a confession from Frank. And he sat there in here, so I thought we were all good. This took place at a voters meeting one Sunday. And at this voters meeting on one Sunday, we'd taken care of the business, and the chairman of the congregation made a cardinal mistake at a voters meeting. He asked the question, is there anything else anybody would like to say? Right? Frank stood up. And Frank launched into me. Basically calling me incompetent, an idiot, that I had no business being a pastor. I had no business doing the job I had. And then he launched in basically to my mental health. Launched into that and saying I must have been crazy, I must have been insane, need to be institutionalized. They got a spot for me on the 5th floor at Southeast Hospital in here. And after he finished launching into me times 2, then he launched into my wife, Betty. And that was just the beginning of a series of process dealing with Frank. And it only got worse from there. See, there's, in everybody's life, there's guys like Frank. I call them the people who are just really hard to love. They may have hurt you. They may have abused you. They may have done something wrong to you. They may have done something in here that hurts and offends you deeply in here. But it's those people, those are the people in here. And those are the hard to love people. And I know you got some in your brains in here. You probably got pictures in front of you in here because I got several. Frank's just one of them. Nobody here. I need to make sure everybody knows that, right? But you got people in front of you. Because the story of the Bible, there's a guy in the Bible who started off as a decent folk. He was one of the decent folks. He wore the right clothes and he hung out with the right people and he talked with the right crowd and he did the right things and he shared the right stuff. If there'd have been a listing of A-listers in the Jesus time, he'd have been an A-lister. He'd have been right there with everybody in here. And somewhere in the midst of this story, he progresses from being a decent folk to one of those guys that was really hard to love. And it came to a head on a night. See, in our day, I think we do it with a hug. It's that bond you have. It's that physical bond you have when you give somebody that hug. You know, you get the polite hugs, you know. But you give somebody that hug that says, I'm there. I'm there with you, and I'm going to be there with you till we're both done. No matter what's going on, no matter what's happening in the world, I'm there. I'm not going to stab you in the back. I'm with you. It's that hug. Well, in Jesus' day, it was a kiss. And so the guy that used to be that decent person now is the guy that's really hard to love, takes and he goes to the ultimate of really hard to love and he kisses Jesus. You catch it by now. Hopefully it's Judas. A guy who was really hard to love. And he's not the only one in this story. There's the guy in here when Jesus is tried and convicted by the Sanhedrin. It's just a little line, and we miss it sometimes if you're not paying attention to it. It says that they spit on him. How many people have seen To Kill a Mockingbird? If you haven't seen To Kill a Mockingbird, you got to go rent, Netflix and watch it. But in the end of that movie, To Kill a Mockingbird, Gregory Peck is standing there, and the first time you see it, right, walks up, and the guy walks up, and he spits right in Gregory Peck's face. And everybody in the movie theater, you go, oh! There's this gasp. People who spit in Jesus' face. There's the guy with the whip that's trying to kill him. There's the guy that drilled the nails through his hands. Guys who are hard to love, but that's exactly who Jesus came to die for. Listen to what John says in his gospel. He says, by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us. He laid down his life for us. Jesus laid down his life for these people who are hard to love. That's how he shows love. He sits there and he says, right, is John 3:16, for God so loved the world. That's the decent people. That's the EGRs. And that's the really hard people too. For God so loved the world that he gave his son. His son showed his love by dying on a cross for us. That's how he shows his love. And he shows his love for, like I said, for those decent people, for the people who are the EGRs, and he shows his people for the really hard, shows his love for the really hard people too, which is really good because if you're like me, we just fall into the hard people. Because we just admitted a few minutes ago in the confession. That's what we said. Confession says that we're the really hard people to love. But see, now this is where this is the roll your sleeves up part of this sermon. So you need to be ready for this one. Because it goes on. Because right now it's good and it's working on in here. But John says these words in verse 18. He says, little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. Remember, this is falling right behind all this showing love in here, and physically showing love, this action that Jesus takes. Listen to the words again. Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. And I tell you, I struggled with this. I've been struggling with this for the last 2 weeks. Because those two words, deed and in truth, it basically means, you put them together, it basically means concrete, real, verifiable, genuine action. Got it? Genuine, concrete, verifiable action. It's not just enough to say it. He wants us to go do it. Now you sit here. This is where it gets hard, because those people, right, those people who are the decent people, that's easy to do with decent folks. And the people who are the EGRs, we can get there. It's a little step. But those people who are really hard to love, it's a struggle, gang. It's not easy. And it gets you down here in the pit of your stomach, and it gets you down here. It's a struggle going in here with the people who are really hard to love. Because that's who we are. It's what God has made us. Yeah, we're the really hard to love people. But in here, that's what he's saying, is that concrete, genuine, concrete, verifiable action. It's going out and loving with that action. We all get to struggle with it. Because sometimes loving's easy. Sometimes loving is good in here. Sometimes loving is simple. Pastor John talked about in Kenya, one of the concrete verifiable action, right? Last week in here in Kenya. Did you remember what it was? Never forget it. Lettuce. Right? If you're here, you giving up the lettuce because missionaries don't get lettuce. Last week it was lettuce. This week it's something else. And yeah, it's hard. And we got to dig down in ourselves, and we got to dig down inside us to figure out what that is and what it means in our lives. We've also got to need to stop and remember where it comes from. That genuine, verifiable action Jesus did. He died on a cross. He gave his life for people, gave his life for us. He gave his life for people in reality like us and us, who are really hard to love. So we would know love, and we would be filled with that love that he gives us. Amen. I ask you to please stand for the benediction.